All right, let's get this one out of the way. Why are so many Americans afraid of communism? Now, we can get into a whole philosophical discussion another day about how communist governments aren't actually communist. They're really practicing totalitarian state socialism, but I'm exhausted. So let's just oversimplify for now and call it communism. Well, the US became fearful of communism for a few simple reasons. Number one, idealistically, most governments in the 20th century that claim to be communists are also anti-democratic. The Soviet Union, Cuba, North Korea, you get the idea. So it was easy for Americans to look at those governments, to look at Stalin, for example, and see him and the system he ruled as the bad guy. Except, he was our number two ally in World War II, which was awkward. But really, it's not all about democracy. Unfortunately, the Cold War in general is actually very rarely about democracy, because as you're going to see, the US is going to support anti-democratic governments all around the world that are opposed to, let's say, left-leaning democratic governments. What's that all about? Reason number two, Marx advocated the violent overthrow of the capitalist system. And who's the capitalist system to end all other capitalist systems? USA! USA. Number three, since the Gilded Age, organized labor has been seen as a threat to our growing economy. Remember Haymarket? It took labor unions decades to convince the public that all union organizers weren't anarchists. And then the Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, and they're like, oh, back to the drawing board. And number four, communism has been equated with foreigners since its beginning, especially these new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who were used pretty easily as political scapegoats. And you might be saying right now, well, communism was foreign. Well, that's true, but so was capitalism, right? Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, was Scottish. And if you're saying to yourself, well, that's not the same, be careful. You're on the verge of a pretty problematic thought about some nationalities being more foreign than others. Fight it. And reason number five why Americans were really afraid of communism is because once the Cold War gets started, it's true that most of the people fighting against American troops around the world are calling themselves communists, right? Soviet spies, North Korean Mao Zedong, Che Guevara speaking against us at the UN, Ho Chi Minh. So even without all the philosophical and historical background, it's easy for boomers especially to grow up being like, whoa, communists are really violent and they hate America. In reality, the Cold War is much less about spreading democracy around the globe and stopping authoritarian rule, and it's much more about ensuring that most governments around the world support us, as in they are friendly with our government and willing to set up their economy in a way that benefits ours. And the communist label is really just a useful tool to justify to the general public why we're constantly going to be interfering in foreign affairs and sending troops to far-off places they've never heard of. Okay, so question number two. When does the Cold War begin? That's another tricky one because the Cold War isn't a war, so it never officially started, right? The Cold War is just a term for the general atmosphere of tension and conflict between the US and the USSR and our allies from around 1945 to 1991, which is when the Soviet Union's going to fall apart. Spoiler alert. The simple answer is just that as soon as Hitler was no longer a common enemy for the Soviets and the Americans, then these two former allies are just kind of left staring at each other from their respective empires. But sometime between 1944 and 1950, the world slowly was divided into camps. The US led the way, pushing free market capitalism as they helped rebuild the war-torn economies around the world. For example, at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference held in New Hampshire, they helped create the World Bank and the IMF to rebuild Europe and develop so-called third world nations in the image of the West. This meant they wanted low barriers to trade so that we could access their resources and markets. On the other side, the USSR had grown considerably as it liberated land from the Nazis during the war. And Stalin did repeatedly go back on his promises that he made about his troops eventually leaving those places, now that the war was over. Instead, the Soviet government absorbed a lot of Eastern European states into its empire and set up their governments and their economic systems in the image of state socialism. This meant that the Soviet leadership could have direct control over their resources and markets. Sure, they wanted to spread communist ideology like Marx envisioned, but taking crops from other war-torn populations like Ukraine to feed their own struggling war-torn population was more pressing to them. If the Cold War began anywhere, I would argue it started in Berlin. All of the Allied powers recognized the strategic importance of Germany and especially its capital city of Berlin. Stalin wanted reparations. He basically wanted to use East Germany as a colony to extract resources to rebuild Russia, kind of as punishment. Remember, Russia lost 27 million people during World War II. But the other allies, the US, Britain, and France, wanted to reunite Germany and help them revive their economy. Kind of not make the same mistakes as the Treaty of Versailles. But they couldn't agree with the Soviets. In the end, not wanting to start another war so soon, they just split Germany down the middle. The East was administered by the Soviets, while the West was controlled by the other allies and eventually allowed to exercise its independence. But here's the tricky part. Berlin was also split in half. So the eastern half of the city became the capital of East Germany, and the western half of the city stayed with West Germany. And this is really hard to imagine unless you're looking at a map, because Berlin is way far east, like over 100 miles from the east-west border. So West Berlin became like this tiny democratic island surrounded on all sides by Soviet-controlled East Germany. By 1948, it was pretty clear that Germany was not going to be reunified anytime soon. In that year, the US helped reorganize the West German economy, and they introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark. We wanted to get their economy up and running again so that it could be integrated with the other Western countries that were our biggest economic allies. But Stalin didn't want to see the western half of the country being pulled farther away from his orbit. The next day, Stalin began blockading West Berlin, and just a few days later, he announced that East Germany would have their own currency too. And this would be the only currency allowed in any part of Berlin, including the West. Basically, he's hoping to use the West Berliners as hostages so that the US would give up its control over the city. So they blocked any supplies or travel in and out. Many believed this was the beginning of a Soviet invasion of West Berlin, and although that never came, it did get really bad. Electricity was cut off, food stopped coming in, and this blockade lasted for 323 days, almost an entire year. And throughout that year, US and British forces flew over Berlin 250,000 times, dropping packages of food and fuel. At its peak, the so-called Berlin Airlift was delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies each day, and a plane was arriving over West Berlin every 30 seconds. Like, the British and US planes combined traveled almost the entire distance from the Earth to the sun in that 1 year. It was a really amazing feat, and it worked. Well, it worked in that Stalin gave up control of West Berlin, but he also started building a wall to keep Easterners from using West Berlin as a loophole to escape Soviet territory. And this event is really a microcosm of the entire Cold War. For 45 years, US and Soviet troops won't directly fight each other, but millions of people will get caught between the two superpowers, with entire countries often being used as pawns in a global chess game. Sometimes the US will use the CIA, other times they'll flood a country with economic support in the hopes of preventing people from turning to communism to begin with. And in a few instances, the US is going to send troops into war. Different tactics, but always with the goal of stopping the spread of communism, even if it's at the expense of democracy. Now, at home, the oversimplified rhetoric of people the government doesn't like being communist enemies was really incredibly useful in the tense post-war years of the 1950s. Remember last episode when we talked about some groups not wanting to just go back to the way things were after World War II? Black Americans continued pushing for victory against racism at home. Some women wanted to keep the liberties they had enjoyed during wartime. The television was spreading new music and new ideas from all over the country, while many white families fled to the suburbs for some peace and quiet. Do you remember how in the 1920s, the decade after World War I, we saw intense cultural clashes between different groups of Americans? Families living in more rural areas increasingly felt disconnected from the rapid growth and modernization happening in the cities. Something similar is happening in the 1950s. Many white families are experiencing their golden age. The economy is booming for them. They can afford a great house and get a good job. Like, we literally just saved the world. What is there to complain about, everybody? So when government officials come along to explain that any of those people who are being loud and marching in the streets and criticizing the country and just not conforming to the American dream, well, they're all actually communist enemies. That makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. It's a simplistic way to look at an increasingly complex world, which often feels a lot better than filling your head with the nuance and contradictions of reality. And into this environment walks Joseph McCarthy. In the early 1950s, during basically the same years as the Korean War, which we're going to talk about in the next episode, Senator Joseph McCarthy attempted to root out communist threats within the government. Of course, he wasn't the only one. The problem with naming a thing after one person, like McCarthyism, is that it's then easy to discount it once that one person is gone. But there were many people in Congress and in the general public who were genuinely concerned about communists or communist sympathizers in the federal government. I mean, the Soviets had literally just been our ally in World War II, so it's not crazy to think that there were still people in our government who didn't see them as our new enemy. In 1948, there was a high-profile investigation of a State Department official named Alger Hiss. Great name for a suspected communist spy. His conviction came about after intense scrutiny and pressure from a young 35-year-old representative from California named Richard Nixon. Partly in response to Alger Hiss, in 1950, Congress passed the McCarran Internal Security Act that required all communist organizations to register with the government and submit to government supervision. Furthermore, any individual who was suspected of promoting totalitarianism, both fascism and communism, could be investigated, barred from federal office, and even kicked out of the country. And this continued the work of WHAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had been investigating anyone connected with totalitarianism since the 1930s. So when this new senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy comes along, waving a piece of paper saying that he has a list of 205 names of people in the State Department who are communist spies, it's A, not outside the realm of possibility, and B, totally legal for him to just start investigating those people however he wants. He went on to lead the Committee on Government Operations, which allowed him to bring any government employee in front of his committee to testify. And he never uncovered any federal employees who were spying for the Soviets, and he never revealed that infamous list he claimed to have. But over 2,000 people lost their jobs because of the investigations anyway. And again, there were real spies out there. Famously, in 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became the first American civilians ever executed for espionage. Julius Rosenberg had worked at Los Alamos as part of the Manhattan Project, and he had arranged a network to pass secrets about our atomic research to the Soviets. Remember, they were our allies in the war at the time, so there were some who justified these actions by arguing that we should want the Soviets to be able to develop their own bomb to help us end the war more quickly. But of course, it was still illegal, and that was definitely not a popular argument in the 1950s, in the height of what's going to become known as our Second Red Scare. The point of all of this is that there were Soviet spies, and McCarthy didn't catch any of them. But you know who he did catch? A lot of LGBTQ people. As usual, during any sort of culture war or societal panic, the people already living on the fringes of society are often the ones who lose the most. So let's pause and do a little bit of LGBTQ history before we get to the so-called Lavender Scare. After World War II, as many young adults had moved and then stayed in large cities, they were increasingly able to build communities based on their identity, like Harlem in the 1920s after the Great Migration. New York City and San Francisco especially became safe havens for LGBTQ people. At the same time, homosexuality was being discussed, although not accepted, much more openly. In 1948, Dr. Alfred Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and he asserted that homosexual activity was actually far more common than previously believed. Unfortunately, at this time, homosexuality was still viewed as a mental illness, a sign of perversion or weakness that made many see gay people as some sort of threat. And I want to be clear, all of this is homophobic BS, but to many at the time, communists and homosexuals seemed eerily similar. Both were believed to be immoral, psychologically disturbed. Communists didn't believe in God, and homosexuals were seen as violating God's teachings. Propaganda convinced Americans that both were trying to undermine the American family and were out to recruit your children to join their subculture. Again, these claims against homosexuality are untrue and incredibly harmful. But these ideas bleed into federal investigations into communist threats. A federal committee literally published a report called Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government, where they determined that there were at least 5,000 homosexuals working in the federal government and that, quote, one homosexual can pollute a government office. It gets even worse. Experts in the government believed that homosexuals were more susceptible to communist influences because both were twisted mentally or physically in some way. And yes, that's a direct quote from a top intelligence official. Many officials believed that since homosexuals were mentally weak and unable to resist their urges, they would also be unable to resist manipulation by Soviet spies. And there were also slightly more rational arguments, like that homosexuals were more susceptible to blackmail by Soviet spies for fear of being exposed and outed as gay. But that problem could have easily been fixed by just, not arresting people for homosexual activity. All of this laid the groundwork for Eisenhower's 1953 executive order, Security Requirements for Government Employment, which added sexuality onto the list of criteria for hiring federal employees. So while McCarthy and others were trying to root out communists in the government, they instead exposed thousands of LGBTQ employees who had been going about their business, living in the closet, at least at work, although often in every aspect of their life. And it's estimated that as many as tens of thousands of LGBTQ people lost their jobs during this Lavender scare. It's impossible to know exactly how many because the vast majority of them just quietly quit to avoid being exposed. Hollywood was another target of the communist witch hunt. Remember that during the war, the brand new film industry was straight up co-opted by the government to create propaganda. So the idea that Hollywood might become a haven for leftists, homosexuals, and straight up communists was kind of a big deal. Famously, 10 directors, producers, and screenwriters refused to answer questions when they were called in to testify in front of WHAC. The Hollywood 10 spent time in prison and then were blacklisted by all the major Hollywood studios for refusing to talk about their colleagues and their own possible communist affiliations. Within Hollywood, there were also friendly witnesses who came before Congress to speak out about communist subversion in Hollywood. Walt Disney himself testified about the growing communist threat in the industry. Totally random. His corporation had just been through a major labor strike, but I'm sure that had nothing to do with his desire to keep left-leaning people out of his industry. And most famously, the young, handsome president of the Screen Actors Guild worked with Congress to identify subversives, many of whom also just happened to be from competing labor unions. Ironically, the actor who would gain prominence as the head of a labor union was eventually going to go on to become arguably our most anti-union president, because this guy was Ronald Reagan. Have we noticed that the Red Scare is the origin story for the two most prominent conservative presidents of the 20th century? Because I think that's really interesting. So what finally brought McCarthy down? Well, he got a little too big for his britches. Sure, you can attack Hollywood liberals and gay office workers, fine, but you're gonna get into trouble if you start attacking the US military. In 1954, McCarthy attempted to expose communist infiltration in the armed services. I'm sorry, you couldn't find any evidence of communism in the federal government, but you think the soldiers who just got done fighting the Korean War are now communists? McCarthy's army hearings were broadcast on national television, so the American people watched as McCarthy viciously interrogated witnesses, including popular high-ranking military officers. Famously, the Army's chief counsel got fed up at one point and yelled, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And I can answer that. No, he did not. McCarthy lost his credibility after those hearings, and he was formally censured by the Senate, and he died just 3 years later of hepatitis. So the Cold War was being fought in indirect battles for control in Europe, and at home by rooting out anyone who wasn't willing to conform to the 1950s vision of American supremacy. But the US was also willing to send its soldiers to fight the spread of authoritarian communist states around the world. Next episode, it's time for us to unforget the forgotten Korean War. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.